Bitcoiners, obviously, you have the leading presidential candidate in the room. His mere presence gets their attention. And then he goes on a, hour-long speech talking about all the things that they care about. Of course, it's going to be well received, right? And I don't think that, frankly, he didn't have anything that he said where Bitcoiners attacked him. And if you think of the Bitcoin community, they are excellent critics. And so for them to walk out of that speech and be like, that was pretty good, is like, a grand slam for any other industry. I like the idea of buying Bitcoin for the US government, but 4 million is almost mathematically impossible. Now, what's interesting about Trump saying the word stockpile was it was coupled not just with the use of the word stockpile, he also never talked about buying more Bitcoin. So he simply said, you know what, I think that we should just keep the Bitcoin that we have, and he stopped there. Now, there's some game theory at play here, is if you lead the US government and you want to go buy Bitcoin, you probably don't want to go tell the world you're going to buy the Bitcoin before you buy it. Instead, you want to go buy the Bitcoin and then tell everyone, hey, we bought Bitcoin, because then there's going to be FOMO, price is going to go up, all that kind of stuff.
Anthony Pompliano starts by emphasizing the nature of campaign promises. He reminds us that promises made by presidential candidates are just that, promises. The real test is whether these promises turn into action once a candidate is in office. However, he notes that the recent statements by a leading candidate have certainly grabbed the attention of Bitcoin enthusiasts. This candidate has made a series of pro-Bitcoin statements, pledging to make the United States a Bitcoin superpower and the global crypto capital. Among his promises were commitments to fire current regulatory officials, change taxation policies to make Bitcoin more attractive, and even create a strategic stockpile of Bitcoin. These statements were music to the ears of Bitcoin supporters, and Pompliano observes that there were no significant criticisms from the Bitcoin community, a notable feat given their reputation for rigorous critique. Please take a little time to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notifications for more videos like this. You can also check out our other videos on cryptocurrencies and the overall digital asset space, and drop your comments and observations in the comments section below. Everything you do helps with the YouTube algorithm and immensely contributes to the channel's growth. Thanks and enjoy the video.
Well, I think first, anytime a presidential candidate starts to talk about campaign promises, you have to remember they are promises. And unfortunately, regardless of the political candidate, you don't know whether those promises will become action until after they're in office. And so evaluating promises is exactly that. They're promises and they're words. But he did say pretty much almost every single thing that Bitcoiners wanted him to say. He said that we were going to become the Bitcoin superpower of the world. I think he said that the United States was going to be the crypto capital of the world. He even worked in a line, Bitcoin is going to the moon. He said that the Bitcoin people were high IQ. He said that people in the room were under fire from the current regulatory regime, that he was going to fire Gary Gensler on day one. He also talked about the fact he thought that the taxation and the treatment of the asset should be changed and make it much more attractive for people to hold and transact. And then the big one was he said that he wanted to create a strategic stockpile of Bitcoin. And the way that he talked about it was, well, the government currently has about 210,000 Bitcoin in its possession. They plan to sell it. Let's not sell it. Why don't we just go move that away from kind of the law enforcement agencies and move that on to kind of the balance sheet of the government? And I think that, Bitcoiners, obviously, you have the leading presidential candidate in the room. His mere presence gets their attention. And then he goes on a, hour-long speech talking about all the things that they care about. Of course, it's going to be well received, right? And I don't think that, frankly, he didn't have anything that he said where Bitcoiners attacked him. And if you think of the Bitcoin community, they are excellent critics. And so for them to walk out of that speech and be like, that was pretty good, is like, a grand slam for any other industry. So nobody knows for sure. And this could be semantics, But what I took away from it was something a little bit different. So Robert F. Kennedy Jr. spoke the day before on Friday at the Bitcoin conference, and he explicitly said not only did he want to hold on to the Bitcoin that the U.S. government already has, he wants the U.S. government to buy 4 million Bitcoin over the next 20 years. He thinks that we can do that by buying 550 Bitcoin per day. I think that's insane. Like, he's got a lot of good ideas. I don't think this is one of them. I like the idea of buying Bitcoin for the US government, but 4 million is almost mathematically impossible. Now, he specifically used the language strategic reserve. And reserve means we go get the Bitcoin, put it into the Federal Reserve or at the Treasury, and it's essentially backing the US dollar. It's part of the dollar reserves, right? We have some gold, we've got other things, right? But we put Bitcoin in there. And so that was kind of what I took away from RFK. Now, after Trump spoke, Senator Cynthia Lummis came up on stage and she had a piece of paper with words on it that she said was a bill that she is going to introduce for the United States to create a strategic reserve of 1 million Bitcoin. She called it the Louisiana Purchase moment for this generation. And for those that don't know the Louisiana Purchase, the United States invested $15 million in the early 1800s, bought 530 million acres from France, France losing into that trade. And the United States obviously was very prescient in doing so. Lummis's point was, why don't we go buy this Bitcoin? And if we buy 1 million Bitcoin, not $1 million, but 1 million Bitcoin, and hold it for a minimum of 20 years, then the price of Bitcoin should continue to appreciate, and that should allow us some sort of relief to help pay off the debt. Now, she also called it a strategic reserve and made it sound much more like she wanted to back the US dollar. Now, what's interesting about Trump saying the word stockpile was it was coupled not just with the use of the word stockpile, he also never talked about buying more Bitcoin. So he simply said, you know what, I think that we should just keep the Bitcoin that we have, and he stopped there. Now, there's some game theory at play here. Is if you lead the US government and you want to go buy Bitcoin, you probably don't want to go tell the world you're going to buy the Bitcoin before you buy it. Instead, you want to go buy the Bitcoin and then tell everyone, hey, we bought Bitcoin, because then there's going to be FOMO, price is going to go up, all that kind of stuff. So you don't know how much of it is like gamesmanship versus he actually doesn't have a desire there. And then the word stockpile to me was almost kind of like, the government's just going to have this thing over here, but it's not actually backing the US dollar. We're not going to put it in the US dollar reserves. And so again, is it semantics? Because kind of like all government assets kind of sort of back the dollar. It's the full faith and credit of the US government, et cetera, is a little unclear. But it would have been so easy to just use the word reserve. Stockpile seems like such an intentional word to use when nobody else was using that word, that I do think it is worth watching, if nothing else, because if you don't back the dollar with the Bitcoin you're buying, do you think the dollar is not going to be valuable? I don't think that's Trump's position. That wouldn't be aligned with what he said previously, but he does ask a lot of questions, about what are his thoughts about this asset.
Pompliano also touches on the game theory at play. If the US government were to buy Bitcoin, it would be strategic not to announce this intention beforehand to avoid driving up the price. Instead, purchasing Bitcoin first and then publicizing it would likely create a FOMO fear of missing out effect, pushing prices higher. The conversation shifts to the broader economic context, where Pompliano discusses the historical relationship between the US dollar and Bitcoin. Contrary to the initial belief that Bitcoin and the dollar would compete, it appears that both have strengthened, with weaker fiat currencies losing out. People tend to buy and hold Bitcoin as a store of value while using US dollars for transactions, evidenced by the growing use of dollar-pegged stablecoins.
I mean, the short, simple answer is like they're pandering for votes, right? Yep. Would be one potential explanation. And there's probably a hint of that in all of them, no matter how sincere they are, is they know by saying it now before an election, it's likely to convince people to go vote for them. And it's a big voter block. It's a very passionate voter block. They got a lot of money, all that kind of stuff. Now, if you get into more of like the nitty gritty of like the economics of it, I think historically people thought that the dollar and Bitcoin were going to compete with each other. It was just, hey, they're both currencies, one's going to win and one's going to lose. What instead we have seen is actually that as Bitcoin has strengthened, the US dollar has strengthened as well. And really the losers in this kind of currency battle in this digital age has been the weak fiat currencies. So it's the non-US dollar fiat currencies that have been the ones that have been falling at the feet of the dollar and at Bitcoin. And so what I think we are starting to see, and again, it's always hard to kind of predict the future, but it seems like people want to buy Bitcoin and hold it, and they want to use dollars for transactions. And so you can see with like stable coins as an example, you now have a digital store of value and you have a digital medium of exchange. The digital medium of exchange in US dollar stable coins has more transaction volume than Bitcoin. And so in the digital realm, you're getting people using the dollar more, but they're holding, more than 50% of all Bitcoin in circulation hasn't moved in 2 years. And so they're more long-term holders, store value, et cetera. And so I think that Trump, who is obviously very pro-US dollar, has not only tweeted, but also campaigned on the idea of the US dollar and the global reserve currency and the attributes of that. He is starting to realize, wait a second, this Bitcoin thing is separate and distinct from the US dollar. And the dollar is going to have to be debased regardless of what we do with this Bitcoin thing. So maybe actually the Bitcoin thing could benefit from a devaluing dollar, but it is not necessarily competing or trying to kill the dollar. And so I can kind of hold these two ideas in my head at the same time without them actually kind of eliminating each other and me having to choose one or the other. What is really going to drive the stock market? It's so dumb, but I really think it just comes down to what is the price of capital. And when you have interest rates that go down, you're going to have asset prices that go up. When you have interest rates that go up, you're going to have asset prices that go down. That is probably the single greatest driver is kind of, price of capital / liquidity in the market. And those two things tend to go, hand in hand. Now, there are times where you might get a divergence. Right now we have, near all-time high stock prices, but we have interest rates at, over 5%. And so it can happen. But if you were to look, give me 100 scenarios, 90 out of 100, you're going to get that relationship between interest rates and asset prices. And so again, interestingly, the Federal Reserve Chairman is not an elected position. The president is not making interest rate decisions, although there are some candidates who they would like to get more control of that decision-making process. And so when you look at that, you say to yourself, am I trying to predict whether the stock market is going to go up or down, or am I trying to predict which policies are going to be more right? And what I've come to the conclusion of is if you're sitting staring at your brokerage account, you should be trying to figure out which direction the stock market is headed. If you're sitting in the ballot box, you should be making decisions based on policies, right? And it's hard not to let those two things cross over each other, but the data, the actual math, objectively, if you look at it, shows that the stock market is not going to be nearly as dependent on who the president is as maybe people would like to think, and vice versa. Is who ends up being considered a good president or not is not necessarily tied to is the stock market up or not. If you look, stocks are near all-time highs. Joe Biden has one of the lowest approval ratings in history. So obviously, stock market going up doesn't just mean that people think you're a good president. And so it's this very weird dynamic of like, how do you separate fact from narrative? And I think people just understanding your brokerage account is different than the ballot box is probably a pretty important lesson to kind of internalize.
Pompliano argues, aligns with the current administration's stance. While supporting the US dollar as a global reserve currency, there is an acknowledgement of Bitcoin's distinct role as a digital store of value. This perspective allows for the coexistence of both assets without one undermining the other. Pompliano also reflects on the broader implications for the stock market and economic policies. He notes that while presidential candidates may influence economic sentiment, the actual impact on the stock market is more directly related to factors like interest rates and liquidity. He uses historical examples to illustrate that stock market performance and presidential approval ratings are not always correlated. Please like and subscribe my channel.